Colorado was caught trying to register illegal voters. They sent, according to the Colorado Democrat who sent them, incorrectly 30,000 voter registration cards to illegals in California. So this has been in a number of different newspapers. It indeed happened. Of course, it was in the Colorado newspapers as well. The Democrat-controlled Colorado Secretary of State's office said that it mistakenly sent 30,000 voter registration cards to illegal aliens and non-citizens. Democrat Secretary of State Jenna Griswold said her office sent postcards that encouraged Colorado residents to register to vote. So it's not enough for her to, of course, send out voter registration information to those individuals who are registered. She's soliciting people and actively solicited people who aren't even citizens of the United States of America. State Department employees looked at 102,000 residents whose names, so it's technically not the State Department of the U.S., but the Secretary of State's office in Colorado, looked at 102,000 residents whose names were given to them by the Electronic Registration Information Center, a nonprofit organization from which most states receive notices about eligible voters who have not yet registered to vote. The names that Eric provided to Colorado's SOS office matched the names in the Department of Revenue's list of residents with driver's licenses. But that driver's license list did not have a normal formatting component that would have allowed employees to identify illegal aliens who received a license under a special program. Well, I thought we had this thing called Real ID that the United States Congress passed, where all 50 states had to implement in those states, in the way that those states chose to implement their licensing requirements for driver's licenses, or if you're not a driver, but you are an adult, an ID form, which looks similar or is similar to a license, but just doesn't allow you to drive since you don't have a driver's license, that provides verification through the Real ID program that you are indeed a citizen of the United States. So obviously this is bogus in Colorado, that they somehow didn't have some of the correct formatting on driver's license to really know who was and who was not illegally present. But that driver's license list did not have normal formatting component that would have allowed employees to identify illegal aliens who received a license under a special program. Yeah, very special. Those illegal aliens, though, possessing a driver's license, are not eligible to vote. Yeah, no kidding. Apparently they're eligible to drive, but they are supposed to have driver's licenses, which identify them as not American citizens, as opposed to those who have a real ID, which means they are American citizens. Griswold sent cards in both English and Spanish in a subtle attempt to encourage illegal aliens to unlawfully register to vote. Exactly. The cards specify that only citizens aged 18 years or older can register to vote in Colorado, which, of course, I'm sure is why they sent them to illegals. So, look, I had to get my new driver's license and I had to get a real ID. And I remember how upset I was initially because I thought, wow, I have to provide my original birth certificate. Original. Okay. Then I had to provide a second form of ID, and I couldn't be my existing driver's license or credit card. It had to be another form of ID. So in theory, I think the state that I live in, which is Maryland, allowed me to use my passport. Because obviously, when you get your passport, you have to provide those similar documents. But Maryland was not satisfied with just the passport. They also wanted, at least at the time that I registered, which, by the way, wasn't that long ago, for my real ID, my actual birth certificate. So I provided that information. I thought to myself, I can't believe this. Born and raised in the United States of America, okay, always followed the rules, followed the laws, and now here I have to go and prove that I'm an American citizen. And the reason I have to prove that I'm an American citizen is because we have open borders in the United States of America. So the citizens in the United States of America are being put in this situation where they are almost second-class citizens because they no longer feel like they belong here or feel like they are American citizens because they're asked to prove that they are indeed citizens of the United States. Then I thought about it a little bit more, and I thought, okay, well, I'm sure the Real ID program was put into place by the United States Congress for the purpose of doing what? Well, basically separating those with IDs in the 50 states as those 50 states choose to implement the program between those who are actual American citizens and those who are not. So you have people who are driving with driver's license where it's been verified that they are indeed not citizens. So this is the bedlam that the United States government has created for us. And I give you that background because it allows states like Colorado and any other state that wants to, where they have a crooked Democrat in charge. And if you ever notice, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a fact to my Democrat listeners, it's only the crooked Democrats that are in control of the voter registration apparatus in certain states. It's only Democrats who are in charge of the voter apparatus in those states who are engaging in this kind of fraud. You're not going to see a Republican who's the Secretary of State or head of a board of elections send out actual solicitations to people who are illegally in the United States and asking them to register to vote. It's always the left that does this. And this story is important because it takes me to another story that is directly related to this idea of open borders, real IDs, registering illegals, whether intentionally or not, and then getting them to vote, and also connected to absentee ballots, ladies and gentlemen. So in Pennsylvania, I'm sure that you all recall that in the 2020 election, there was an absentee ballot just disaster. Okay. And of course, if you're a Democrat, you're like, it wasn't a disaster. It was a success. Yeah. As a Republican, and more importantly than that, ladies and gentlemen, as an American, I believe that you should be voting in person. And you've heard me say this many times before, but we're going to talk about this in more detail as to why this is so important. So, interestingly enough, in Pennsylvania, you had one case where an individual was running for a judgeship, and there were 257 mail-in ballots that weren't counted in his race because they weren't dated. That's the thing about this, okay? You have a mail-in ballot. It's sent to you. The mail-in ballot is mailed to you. You receive the mail-in ballot. You mark your mail-in ballot and vote for the person or persons that you want to win. And then you put the mail-in ballot, in theory, at the post office. I'm guessing that's probably the best place, although naturally in 2020 it was drop boxes as well, which created another problem. But you put a stamp on it, and in theory, you're supposed to date. You're supposed to date, your actual mail-in ballot. Now, why are you supposed to date it? Because when you have drop boxes, ladies and gentlemen, there's no postage mark going on the absentee ballot. It's not going through the postal system. So there's no way for the postal system to say, oh yeah, we received this the day of voting, so therefore it should be counted. And here is the stamp that said it was processed through the postal office on the day of voting, but not after. You can't do that with a drop box, of course. And what you can do is, even though, and we all know this, by the way, that there's no way that the drop boxes were picked up in a timely manner the night of the election, when the election was over. So all of these problems occurred in Pennsylvania, and they were logistics problems, but they were also problems that were created intentionally. And so you have this guy, he's running for a judgeship. His name is David Ritter, and he's a Republican, and he was ahead in the race. But then there were 257 mail-in ballots that didn't have dates, so no one actually knew when they were cast. So think about this. It's the day of the election. Then it's the night of the election, and you're winning, and you've won, except for the mail-in ballots. And miraculously, there are 257 mail-in ballots that happen to change the outcome of the election, and they don't have dates on them because we don't know when they were actually cast, because we have drop boxes rather than them being processed through the post office. So the Supreme Court of the United States of America finally has heard this case, if you will, and they vacated an appeals court decision. The Supreme Court did. So the Supreme Court vacated the appeals court decision that required Pennsylvania to count those ballots, even though they didn't have a date. So in other words, the Supreme Court said this decision by the appeals court is vacated. It's gone, doesn't exist, because it is wrong. So we have a really quick news story on this. This is actually from the Epoch Times, because God knows you won't hear this from CBS, NBC, ABC, MSNBC, or CNN. And we have this real quick clip, and here it is.
The Supreme Court just ruled that Pennsylvania doesn't have to count mail-in ballots if there isn't a date on the envelope. The decision vacates a previous ruling by a court of appeals. The case centers around David Ritter, an unsuccessful Republican candidate for county judge. Ritter lost his 2021 bid after just over 250 mail-in ballots that didn't have dates were counted. The Supreme Court also overturned the ruling that allowed the county to count those ballots. It doesn't change Ritter's loss in the case, but it does mean that it can't be used as a precedent.
So yes, so you have this new story that has come out. Remember, it's a couple of years after the actual 2020 election, and you have finally this case working up to, and has worked up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard it and it's like, yeah, no, that's you can't have absentee ballots that aren't dated, because the whole point of having absentee ballots is to demonstrate that you voted in a timely manner by the time that the election is actually over. The day of voting, those absentee ballots are in theory supposed to be in the possession of the Board of Elections and or dated in such a way through the post office that they were received in a timely manner. Okay, fine. This makes perfect sense. But ladies and gentlemen, this underscores what I'm talking about. This conversation underscores why absentee ballots are so disastrous to the health of our elections and to the actual belief that we're having free and fair elections. And what's different now, as opposed to all of us discussing this, let's say a year ago or 2 years ago, is now we actually have these cases and the truth is coming out. And we're hearing these stories one after another where just mysteriously, a ballot doesn't have a date on it. Okay, well, here's an idea, because I know what the folks on the left are going to say. They're going to say, oh, well, it's because the poor elderly people and people who are of color, they just don't know how to fill out their ballot properly. I've heard this before, by the way, and I'm not making this stuff up. I've literally had Democrats say to me in the legislature, well, people who are homeless, they don't know how to fill these out. People who are black and brown. I actually had a delegate say that once. I remember the House of Delegates. They don't know how to, many of them at least, don't know how to fill out ballots properly and don't know they're supposed to be dated. And in addition to that, there are a lot of elderly people who, just have some memory loss and they don't recall or remember that they had to have put the date on there. To which, of course, you can say, well, if they actually mailed them, then there would be a stamp on there from the post office, which would say when it was received and processed. Or if they don't know how to properly mark a ballot. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, there are a lot of people that don't, to be fair. Okay, they don't. That's why you vote in person, because you have election board people there and poll watchers there to assist you. And guess what? When you do vote in person, you know that when you finish marking your ballot, at least in my state. There's a paper ballot that you mark. And when you are finished marking the ballot, you then scan the ballot yourself into a scanner that then counts that ballot. And then that ballot then drops inside of that scanner so you have a paper backup. That's how that occurs in my state. And if you ever have an issue while you are voting in person, the day of the election, or early voting, by the way, you just ask someone that's there, hey, look, I'm a little confused about this ballot. I'm a little confused. What I'm confused about is the fact that there are 3 candidates that are here on the ballot for this particular school board race, and it says I'm only supposed to vote for 2. What if I want to vote for all 3? You know, people ask questions like that, okay? It happens all of the time. And so, you know what won't happen when you vote in person? When you vote in person on the day of the election, you know what will not happen? You will not forget to date the ballot. You want to know why you won't? Because you're obviously voting on time, because you're there in person. And so we have this issue with absentee ballots in Pennsylvania and other states where absentee ballots were cast. They were not dated. Obviously, they weren't postmarked because they were put into drop boxes. No one knows how they got there. No one knows who filled them out. No one knows when they were dropped in there. No one knows actually even where they came from. No one bothered to call the people who voted to see if they actually voted, I don't think. And all of that could have been avoided. All of that confusion of not properly dating your ballot could have been avoided if the people just showed up and voted in person, including early voting. So if you have a week of early voting, 7 full days of early voting, and then you have the day of voting, so you have 8 days of in-person voting between early voting and the day of voting, what more do you need? What more do you need to make sure that your ballot counts? And so we have this really strange thing in the United States of America, this strange phenomenon where the Democrat Party has decided, for whatever reason, and it's always Democrats, ladies and gentlemen, and for you Democrats that are listening to me, you know it's true because I've seen how you vote on these issues. I've been there and watched you. I've heard your BS arguments about the need for mass mail-in balloting and also drop boxes and your arguments for ballot harvesting. I mean, it's just incredible. And I've heard all of those arguments, and yet all of your arguments are literally what is undermining the people of the United States believing that we have free and fair elections. And that is the worst possible thing for our republic. And yet the solution is obviously so simple. So you have to have the Supreme Court of the United States of America actually weigh in after the lower court said, oh, no, you can count those ballots even though they're not dated. What's the purpose of having an election day then? What's the purpose of having a beginning and end of an election day? Because the end of the election day means that's it. You don't get to keep voting to get the outcome that you want. Oh, yeah, you get to keep voting until you get the outcome that you want. That's what the Democrats clearly are trying to get to. So the Supreme Court had to take this case and say, no, we're going to vacate those lower courts' decisions. And from this point forward, you cannot count these ballots. Now, of course, it's up to the legislatures now, the state legislatures in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, to fix this problem. What is the problem that we're trying to get them to fix? To basically bring voting back to in-person voting, where you have to do a number of things. One is you need to show up during early voting or the day of voting, and you need to show your ID, your real ID. Yes, your real ID, because that obviously demonstrates that you are really a citizen of the United States, and then vote in person. And when you have issues or concerns, you just ask the people there. So it's very transparent who's voting, who's there, and who's being helped. And there are no issues. Because I'm pretty sure that if you voted in person, you're not going to have any of the issues that have come up since the 2020 or during the 2020 election and concerns about cheating because of the simple fact that you have all of the people that are in there who are knowledgeable the day of voting and early voting to assist you. And so even in Wisconsin, we've had this issue as well. So get this. In Wisconsin, the judge orders officials to stop allowing voters to spoil ballots and cast new ones. Okay, this is a brand new story that just came out. So voters in Wisconsin can't cancel their ballot and cast a new one once a vote has been cast, a state judge has ruled. Think about this. You cast your ballot and then you come back and say, well, I want to cast a new one now. Well, a judge in Wisconsin has said, nope, can't do that. So Waukesha County, isn't that how you say it? Yeah, Waukesha. I always have a hard time with that name because it's just, I know it's a Native American name, but it's just like kind of out there. So Waukesha County Circuit Court Judge Brad Schimmel granted a request on October 5th for a temporary injunction against the practice, which had been promulgated to officials across the state by the Wisconsin Election Commission. Wisconsin voter Nancy Cormanek sued the Wisconsin Election Commission over its guidance, which states that clerks can give completed and submitted absentee ballots back to a voter, arguing that doing so violates a Wisconsin law that states that the clerk shall not return the ballot to the elector once submitted. The guidance was issued after several candidates dropped out of high-profile races, including Democrat candidates for the U.S. Senate, such as Alex Lasry. Schimmel, a Republican and a former Wisconsin attorney general, sided with Cormanek and ordered an injunction. That injunction took place on October 7th. Restoring Integrity and Trust in Elections is representing Cormanek. The group was started by a former Bush administration official, Karl Rove, and others. Quote, today's ruling is another major victory for Wisconsin voters. WEC's unlawful guidance destroys voter confidence and taints the integrity of Wisconsin's elections. Once a vote is cast, it is cast, period. Derek Lyons, president and CEO of the group, said in a statement. So, folks, here's actually what happened in Wisconsin. They're basically saying in the 2020 election, at least the Wisconsin Election Commission was saying, it's okay to cast a ballot that is a mail-in ballot. So you fill it out at home, and then you mail it in, or you put it in a drop box like they did in 2020. And then once it's cast, a week later or 2 weeks later, you basically call the Elections Commission in Wisconsin and say, well, I want to do a redo. I want to revote. Now, imagine all the things that can go wrong with that, right? So the ballot is in. Okay. It's been collected. It's there at the Wisconsin Election Commission. And now people are like, oh, I want to change my vote. I want to alter it. So, folks, that has created bedlam in Wisconsin. And this goes to the broader conversation of this podcast about absentee ballots as to why it is so important to bring voting back to in person in Wisconsin, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Nevada, in North Carolina, in Arizona. Fix all of these states, in Georgia. By fixing, I'm saying we have to have early voting combined with the day of voting. Look, for me personally, I think the day of voting is sufficient, but fine. I've compromised. Early voting, a week of early voting plus a day of voting. That's enough. Show up and vote. Then there aren't going to be any issues with your ballot because by definition, you were there and you did cast your ballot and you take responsibility for how you cast it. You don't get to change it once you leave. Okay. Oh, I've left and I've cast it and I've scanned it into the machine. Hey, I want to come back and change it now. Nope, not going to happen. And this is how we can finally repair our system. And I just want to finish with this, ladies and gentlemen. It is, and I've said this already, but it's important to underscore this point. It's exclusively the Democrat Party and the Democrat operatives and the Democrat elected officials who want to game our election system by expanding absentee ballots, by allowing them to be counted without being properly dated or dated at all, by using drop boxes, by not having voter ID, and by having endless elections where there's really no beginning and end to the election. It's just an election that continues until the outcome is one in which they agree with.